This episode is sponsored by The Book. In the early 1960s, with Cold War tensions running high and the Soviet war machine looming across the Iron Curtain, two old rivals, Britain and France, embarked on an unlikely collaboration to redefine the tactical strike aircraft. The fear was clear. If the Soviets came, they would come fast, with endless columns of tanks and waves of troops crashing into Western Europe like a red tide. This threat needed a new kind of response, one that could strike first and strike hard. Out of that urgency came the Jaguar. This Anglo-French machine wasn't just another jet, it was built to live at treetop height, skimming hedgerows and barns, while its advanced navigation and weapons aiming computers hunted targets with lethal precision. Every so often, the aircraft industry produces a truly exceptional design. In the late 40s, it was the English electric Canberra. The Hawker Hunter in the 50s, and in the 60s, it was the Jaguar. For anyone doubting how dangerous the big cat really was, here's the challenge. Choose your target, specify your defenses, now try and stop a well-flown Jaguar. So as always, pop the kettle on, make a brew, open a pack of bourbons, and let's crack on with the story of the unstoppable Jaguar. For frequent viewers of the channel, it'll come as no surprise that I love a good old deep dive into the development histories of Cold War aircraft. And with few exceptions, none are as fascinating, politically tangled, fantastically messy with more drama than your wife going through your browser history than a SEPECAT Jaguar. But before we jump into the glorious Jaguar's history,
a word from our sponsor. Marcel?
Ever wonder what you'd actually do if civilization collapsed? No power, no internet, no Google, and heaven forbid no tea or biscuits. Just you, a few days survivors, and the smouldering ashes of the modern world. Would you know where to start? Do you know how to make fire, find water, build a steam engine? Well, I would, because I fully intend to become King Joe of London. How? Because I have the book. It's not just a survival guide, it's an engineering master plan for rebuilding civilization. Over 400 pages with 180 essential topics across 23 chapters: fire, medicine, metalworking, fuel, engines, and even flight. Yeah, there's even an entire section on building actual aircraft, wings, propellers, control surfaces, all in beautifully hand-drawn detail. This thing is gorgeously made. Premium matte art paper, medieval meets engineering illustrations, and a hardcover that looks like something you'd find in a wizard's workshop. It's not just a book, it's a work of art. A top Kickstarter bestseller and a perfect gift for anyone who geeks out over science, engineering, history, or just likes rebuilding stuff. With input from more than 50 professionals, engineers, scientists, artists, and more. So, want one? When you scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description, you get 10% off your copy. Because surviving is fine, but wouldn't you prefer rebuilding and declaring yourself supreme leader of a post-apocalyptic world? So a big thank you to The Book for sponsoring this video. Now back to the story. On paper, the Jaguar was everything a strike aircraft of the 1970s needed to be. Rugged, fast, versatile, and deadly accurate. But as you'll see in this story, the Jaguar's fate was decided by greed, national pride, and clashing industrial agendas that conspired to clip its wings. Even in France, one of its own parent nations, politics and self-interest kept this aircraft from reaching its true potential. The Jaguar's origins trace back to the early 1960s, when Britain and France launched what became the world's first truly successful international program to produce a frontline combat aircraft. It was by all accounts a remarkable achievement, not least because the two nations had long been wary of one another with no shortage of political differences. In the early 1960s, France launched its ECAT requirement program, which stood for École de Combat et d'Appui Tactique, or School for Combat and Tactical Support. The goal? to obtain a ground attack aircraft that could be bought in large numbers to replace types like the Super Mystère, Republic F-84F, North American F-100s, and be rugged enough to operate from both paved runways and many Aero Club grass strips found throughout France, with a weapon carrying capacity of around 1,300 pounds or 590 kilos, which was an extremely small amount considering the future weapon load of the Jaguar. I've also read in an old aviation magazine from the 1980s that this aircraft was also there to complement the highly expensive Dassault Mirage 3V, a heavy V-STOL aircraft. Let me know in the comments if there's any substance to this story. Flight training was another ECAT requirement, aimed at eventually replacing the Lockheed T-33 and Dassault Mystère, and preparing pilots for the supersonic Mirage 3. However, eventually this role was to go to the Franco-German Dassault Brigade Dornier Alpha jet. Across the channel, the RAF had, or was at least talked into having, a requirement, Air Staff Target 362, for a high-performance supersonic advanced jet trainer to replace the two-seat Gnat. This aircraft was intended to bridge the gap between the Jet Provost and the planned TSR-2 and the Hawker Siddeley P1154, and also to replace the Hawker Hunter in the ground attack role, all to be ready by the mid-1970s. To justify the development of a new aircraft, it was to have slightly better performance than a Northrop T-38 Talon, i.e. a maximum speed of at least Mach 1.5 rather than 1.3. It was also to have an endurance of at least 1 hour on internal fuel, including a 10-minute supersonic dash, and operate from a 6,000-foot wet runway. The RAF, in marked contrast to the later requirement for the BAE Hawk that replaced the Gnat, insisted on 2 engines as essential for flight safety. Thus, while the British wanted a souped-up T-38, the French wanted what might be described as a pragmatic, utilitarian, cheap and straightforward aircraft. These requirements were coming out during a time when the British aircraft industry was still suffering from the fallout of the 1957 Defence White Paper, in which Duncan Sandys, the British Defence Minister at the time, had stated that the days of manned aircraft were numbered, to be replaced by a future filled with guided missiles. Although the paper didn't explicitly declare manned aircraft obsolete, it argued that the primary threat to the UK now came from Soviet ballistic missiles rather than manned bombers. Consequently, new interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft projects were deemed less critical. The impact was immediate and severe. The white paper led to the cancellation of most major advanced aircraft programs, including the Avro 730 supersonic reconnaissance bomber, advanced derivatives of the Gloucester Javelin interceptor, and the Hawker P1121 supersonic fighter bomber, to name just a few. The fallout reshaped Britain's aviation industry. Historic firms such as Sanders Row, Gloucester and many others struggled without government contracts and were either absorbed into larger conglomerates like Hawker Siddeley and the British Aircraft Corporation, or just simply faded away. But this didn't mean new military aircraft production was completely ruled out. We still had the TSR-2 and the Hawker Siddeley P1154 underway. Plus we had the English Electric Lightning rolling off the production line. From my understanding from various sources, it seems that the 1957 white paper led to the wording of Air Staff Target 362 that was in such a way that it had inherent mission creep built in, intended to evolve into something more than just an advanced trainer. In other words, it was intended to sneak an aircraft with secondary combat potential under the noses of the men in Whitehall. Proposals for AST 362 were submitted by multiple manufacturers. Naturally, given the climate of tightening purse strings, the competition was fierce. BAC offered the P45 design from the Wharton Drawing Office of English Electric, intended for use as a supersonic strike/trainer to be powered by either a single-spay RB168 or 2 RB172 engines with a top speed of Mach 1.7. Hunton and Luton proposed the H155, while Hawker Siddeley put forward the Folland Foe 147. After Hawker Siddeley took over Folland in 1959, a particular design caught the eye of the new management. This was the Mark V, a supersonic single or two-seat aircraft fitted with a Ferranti radar, powered by a pair of Rolls-Royce engines with reheat and armed with missiles, expected to reach Mach 2 and intercept targets up to 50,000 feet. Hawker Siddeley adapted the basic design of the Mark V with a variable geometry wing with the object of creating a multi-purpose aircraft and given a name FO 147 and presenting it as a viable contender to fulfill AST 162. Meanwhile, over in France, the competition for the ECAT was no less fierce, except with berets. The French, also feeling the squeeze and constrained by budget, leaned toward a simpler subsonic design akin to the old Hawker Hunter. Dassault presented their design the Cavalier, Pathé the P92, Suez Aviation forwarded the SA-12, Nord Aviation the 3600 Harpoon, and Breguet came in with the BR-121, which used the BR-1001 Taon or Gadfly single-seat light attack aircraft as the basis of their design. I must point out here that only 2 Breguet BR-1001 Taon prototypes were ever built, which were entered into NATO's light fighter competition, which lost out to the lovely little Fiat G91. Subsequently, the Taon never saw production. Even before the design competition had kicked off, the shenanigans had already started. Marcel Dassault, the formidable boss of Dassault Aviation, although sure that his design for the ECAT program would be victorious, he wanted to hedge his bets, and to that end signed an agreement with Nord Aviation that should either company win, the other would become an equal partner in the project. In the end, the Breguet BR-121 concept was selected as the basis for the ECAT aircraft in 1964, mainly because it was smaller, lighter and better aligned with the budget considerations at that time. However, it was also chosen due to political considerations within France, rather than solely on its perceived technical superiority. Dassault lost out due to the French government's concern that it would have had a monopoly on military aircraft if it were awarded this contract. Therefore, it was instead handed to Breguet, a decision that angered Marcel Dassault, who was famously protective of his company and considered his entry to Cavalier far superior. He felt this was a stab in the back, and unaccustomed to losing, he wouldn't forget this slight and would remain in the background using any opportunity to undermine the Jaguar, but this wouldn't be the last time this project drew his ire. But winning this contract was a temporary shot in the arm for the ailing Breguet, which hadn't been a major player in combat aviation beyond a few prototypes in over 2 decades, leading many to believe this choice to be a mistake. Initially, the Breguet company designed 5 different variants of the 121 at once, covering all possible areas of use of the aircraft. They had the BR-121A fighter bomber, the 121B a 2-seat version, the BR-121C fighter interceptor, the 121E aircraft for advanced training, and finally the BR-121P reconnaissance aircraft. While this was all going on, back over in London, the Labour government of the day, led by Prime Minister Harold Wilson in early 1965, as part of the UK's rationalisation of defence spending, decided to take an axe to the Hawker Siddeley P1154 vertical takeoff fighter that was supposed to replace the Sea Vixen and the aging RAF Hunter. At the same time, the TSR-2 project was put on notice, only for it to be canned 2 months after its maiden supersonic flight in favour, as one of my aviation friends once said, for a flying hunk of junk called the F-111. Ultimately, the cancellation of TSR-2, the cost which, adjusted for inflation to 2025 values, would equate to roughly between £3.5 and £4 billion, was now all flushed down the pan. I promise that one day I'll cover the TSR-2 story. I just need to get myself to RAF Museum Cosford to get the footage first. How many times have I said that? Right, so the Wilson government, eager to secure Britain's entry into the European Common Market, the forerunner of today's European Union, began to wonder if they could turn the French and British projects into a single machine. If they could, then it might become a useful political pawn. His goal was to win the trust of French President Charles de Gaulle, who had blocked Britain's bid in 1963 to join, and in doing so remove a major obstacle to membership, a step he viewed as vital to halting the UK's economic decline. This was a little naive, given that Britain and France had already signed agreements on airframe and engine development for the aircraft that would later become known as Concorde, yet de Gaulle still said no, which was typical, and it rankled the British to no end. To quote Sir George Edwards, chairman of BAC, at the time, about the only Englishmen who were still speaking to the French were the engineers on the Concorde. As a side note, despite all the challenges, numerous joint Anglo-French programs in aviation were established over time, including the Lynx, the Puma, and Gazelle helicopters. In one story that I came across, it was claimed that the idea of merging efforts was conjured up during a breakfast meeting in Paris between UK Defence Minister Peter Thornycroft and his French counterpart. Champagne over Rice Krispies must be a hell of a thing. However, the task of making this unlikely marriage work fell to two men, Handel Davis on the British side and Engineer General Lecamus on the French. Handel Davis, for those who are not aware, was a prominent aeronautical engineer and senior civil servant who spent decades shaping British aviation through various government posts and was hugely instrumental in key projects like Concorde and Tornado. Opposite him in the French corner was Engineer General Jean Lecamus, less known outside defence circles but equally influential. Together, they co-chaired the Anglo-French Committee to formally align Britain's AST 362 requirements with France's ECAT programme. The argument was simple. No single country could really afford to design everything on its own anymore, and a joint project promised savings, shared risk, and politically something that looked like genuine European cooperation in defence. By the end of 1964, sufficient joint consultations had been made to issue a common operation requirement for a single aircraft to fulfill the joint needs of the respective air arms of the two countries. Of the various suitable designs existing at the time, the BR-121 was eventually selected to become the basis of the joint Anglo-French venture. Still, it was suggested by the British side that the aircraft be upgraded to be a more formidable ground attack aircraft. Here comes that mission creep. These changes represented a significant shift in the original French ECAT plans. Naturally, with Britain agreeing to shoulder half the costs, and with the arrangement providing much needed production work for the struggling brigade, advancing its technology and boosting the French Air Force's battlefield strike capabilities, the changes were accepted with remarkable speed. Yet from the start, the aircraft that would become the Jaguar was only one half of a much larger bargain. The Anglo-French agreement was deliberately structured as a twin-track deal. France would lead the light strike trainer program that became the Jaguar, while Britain would take the lead on another joint venture between BAC and Dassault. This second aircraft would be a much larger, more powerful supersonic swing-wing multi-role fighter derived from the English electric P-45 design, named the AFVG or Anglo-French Variable Geometry. This arrangement kept both nations' industries invested and ensured that neither side felt reduced to a junior partner. For France, the calculation was simple. President Charles de Gaulle wanted to show a measure of cooperation with Britain after blocking its entry into the common market. Without a doubt, the AFVG was nothing less than a lifeline for Britain after the politically painful and humiliating loss of the TSR-2 project in 1965, which had left the RAF without a potential modern strike aircraft. What is little known is that in the wake of the TSR-2 cancellation, Dassault and the British Aircraft Corporation were ready to offer an alternative, the so-called Spey Mirage. Officially, the Mirage 4S was a re-engined version of the Mirage 4 bomber, refitted with Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans and stretched 2 feet to carry more fuel. The plan was ingenious. The idea was to graft British avionics and weapons onto the French airframe, terrain following radar, guided munitions, the works, and present London with a cheaper, quicker answer to fill the gap left by the TSR-2's loss, which could be in service by as early as 1969. Yet inside Whitehall, the news was received like a fart in an elevator. Dennis Healey, Prime Minister Wilson's formidable defence secretary, the man who had cancelled the P1154 and the TSR-2, saw the Spain Mirage project as an attempt by BAC to derail his strategy, which was, from what I can gather, to hot-foot it to Washington and buy the American F-111. To say he wasn't pleased was an understatement. To keep the whole arrangement from unravelling, he threatened to strip BAC of work altogether and handing it to Hawker and leaving BAC to ponder its sins. Meanwhile, Ministry of Defence mandarins warned the company that it was, and I quote, balmy to persist. RAF officials even leaned on pilots to bury the extremely complimentary reports they had written after having test flown the Mirage 4. What made matters worse, from Paris's perspective, was that London seemed to be shelving the perfectly good Spain Mirage proposal in favour of buying into America's F-111. But Healey and his team were determined. Britain would buy the American swing-wing aircraft, and the Anglo-French cooperation would be limited to the Jaguar and the AFVG. But for some reason, he believed that BAC was trying to scupper his AFVG project, which was absurd. BAC wanted both the AFVG for the future, but they saw the Spain Mirage filling a more immediate need. Dassault, who would have done very well out of the deal, were understandably furious, and in Paris there was bitter talk of perfidious Albion, of Britain's lip service to European solidarity while remaining a vassal of Washington. In the end, the Spain Mirage went nowhere and was never more than a spoiler. The Mirage 4 had been built as a high-altitude nuclear bomber. Re-engined or not, it struggled to meet the RAF's unforgiving low-level strike requirements. Even with the Space, it fell short of the 1,000 nautical mile combat radius demanded by Air Staff Requirement 343, the very reason TSR-2 had been conceived in the first place. Worse still, the strategic rationale was evaporating. By late 1967, Britain's east of Suez commitments were being abandoned, and with them the need for long-range strike aircraft. Ultimately, all the messing about with the F-111 came to nothing, and when the F-111K was cancelled in early 1968, any hope of a Spain Mirage disappeared with it. For Dassault, the rejection stung. They had offered London a stake in the French design, only to be rebuffed in favour of Washington, and aggrieved by the loss of the Spain Mirage, they would have their revenge. But for the moment, however, for France, collaboration with London still offered advantages, not least the steady stream of British money into the French aircraft industry, particularly to keep the struggling brigade afloat. On the 17th of May 1965, both governments signed a Memorandum of Understanding to move forward on both aircraft, where France would lead the development of the new light ground attack aircraft based on the Brigade BR-121 for both the French and British Air Forces, while Britain would lead on a new multi-role AFVG designed to fulfill RAF strike and interceptor roles and to serve as a carrier fighter for the French Navy. This agreement was signed just before the 1965 Paris Air Show at Le Bourget Airport, where a wooden mock-up of the BR-121 was displayed. However, they needed a name for their new creation, which translated nicely in both languages. Many names were suggested, but Henri Ziegler, the president of Brigade, rang BAC saying, "We need a name. I suggest Jaguar." However, before they could proceed, they needed permission from William Lyons, the boss of Jaguar Cars. Some say he was on holiday and unreachable over the telephone, so they went with the name regardless. Neither air forces were consulted. Getting back to the AFVG project, which on paper was quite a good multi-role strike fighter. The initial requirement was ambitious. This was to be a twin-engined aircraft powered by a Franco-British turbofan, the M45G, being co-developed by Senecma and Bristol Siddeley, that was expected to push the machine up to Mach 2.5 at an altitude of 60,000 feet and 800 knots at sea level, have a 500 nautical mile combat radius, and the ability to carry both nuclear and conventional weapons. The RAF initially saw the AFVG replacing the Lightning in the interceptor role. However, when Britain opted for the American F-4 Phantom, the AFVG was reassigned as a strike aircraft, even being earmarked to complement the planned F-111K purchase, which, as we know, fell through. But Marcel Dassault never warmed to the idea of sharing with BAC on a significant program, and still harbouring resentments over the loss of both the Spey Mirage and ECAT, had no qualms about going behind the backs of his partners. While officially attending AFVG meetings, Dassault was simultaneously pushing ahead with rival projects, the Mirage F1 and the Swingwing Mirage G, built in its workshops and even benefiting from AFVG research. As time went on, progress on the joint fighter slowed, costs climbed, and in June 1967, the French government abruptly withdrew, citing tightening finances.
And it's gone.
Soon after, London discovered that funds had been quietly diverted to the Dassault project.
What?
Leaving Britain £2.5 million out of pocket for almost nothing tangible in return.
It's gone. It's all gone.
The collapse triggered anger in Parliament, and no one was more furious than Denis Healey. Another door was slammed shut in his face, and again the RAF was without replacement for its aging strike fleet. BAC, unwilling to let the work die, reworked the AFVG design into a purely British strike aircraft, the UKVG. But with no domestic funding for full production, Britain scouted around for partners, and in July 1968 signed a new memorandum with West Germany, Italy and later others. The collapse of both TSR-2 and AFVG eventually pushed Britain and BAC into the most important military project in modern UK aviation, the Multi-Role Combat Aircraft Programme. Its outcome? The Tornado, which was an outstanding achievement, but one which owed its existence less to coherent strategy than to the very chaos of Britain's bumbling defence planning. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. Returning to the Jaguar. Unlike the suspicion and politics of the AFVG program, the partnership between BAC and Breguet was like a marriage made in heaven. Once the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, the ball started to roll very quickly, with a new joint Anglo-French company being duly formed to administer the design and manufacturing of the Jaguar, registered in France in May 1966. This company was called SEPECAT. Most of you aviation sorts will already know that it stands for Société Européenne de Production de l'Avion, École de Combat et d'Appui Tactique, or in King's English, the European Company for the Production of Combat Training and Tactical Support Aircraft. Having a company was a tidier, more business-like arrangement than a nebulous and politically fraught Concord partnership. The SEPECAT company was effectively a ghost company with no permanent staff. Instead, it drew upon the design, manufacturing and admin resources of both Breguet and BAC, with the agreement that all the costs and any new technology in the project would be divided equally, a principle that was scrupulously observed. To ensure that everything was even Stevens and above board, SEPECAT's work was overseen by an Anglo-French management committee comprising 4 officials from each country, and to ensure even-handedness, the post of president alternated annually between the French and the British. As you can imagine, the BAC and Breguet teams soon found themselves having to bridge the language gap, and as we British are not known for our multilingual abilities, it was just as well that English dominated. However, it was peppered with a makeshift franglais that grew from late-night meetings and French lessons and plenty of gitans and coffee. In the meantime, the design and engineering departments reached a mutual understanding by writing down figures on blackboards and drawing little diagrams. Another issue which arose was the metric versus imperial system of feet and inches. Interestingly, the prototype was virtually hand-built, with the English system being used for any parts made by BAC, whereas the metric system was followed for the parts made by Breguet. This was a headache that couldn't continue, so one system or the other had to be chosen. This was when Britain was gradually moving towards the metric system, but surprisingly the English system was selected to standardise on feet and inches, much to everyone's surprise. As a side note, if you ever want to fry your brain, look up the old English money system, the only era where you could go to the pictures, then to the pub, spend the night drinking, get a fish supper, and somehow come home with more money than you left with. Surprisingly, if you look closely, these two systems could even be found in the aircraft's cockpit. Royal Air Force Jaguars had afterburner nozzle indicators with their units of measure and descriptions written in French. Initial agreements between Paris and London stipulated that each country would purchase 150 aircraft. Brigade for their part were very enthusiastic, considering that despite British involvement, this was their aircraft and the two governments had just purchased 300 of them. This was quite different from the usual method of building a prototype or two and then waiting until someone either comes along and buys it or cancels the project. Initially, the RAF was to have only advanced trainers known as the B or the biplace version. In contrast, the French would have 75E for école or trainer versions and 75A for appui or tactical support versions, which could operate in advance of their strike force, softening up targets such as SAM and radar sites. When the French cancelled the AFVG, it left the RAF with significant gaps in the strike role. With this, the RAF had no option but to operate the offensive role of the Jaguar to take over the close air support, reconnaissance and tactical strike roles. This strategic reassignment was intended to free up the McDonnell Douglas Phantom FGR-2 to concentrate primarily on air defense duties, and so started the mission creep and the push for a higher performance machine. With so many needs on the table, SEPECAT found itself developing no fewer than 5 distinct versions of the aircraft at the same time. This meant that the original BR-121 design, which began life as a humble trainer and light attack aircraft, had to be taken back to the drawing board and extensively modified, driving up costs and complexity. The wing section was thinned for greater speed, the weapons load increased, and the fuselage was modified, all of which naturally increased the weight, meaning that the engine thrust had to be increased to handle all the changes. For the training variant, the front fuselage was also redesigned to give the instructor in the rear cockpit better sightlines. Does anyone else think that the forward fuselage droop look of the T2 reminds you of the Cheyenne dropship from Aliens? Let me know in the comments. Thus, a new amendment was made to the Memorandum of Understanding in January 1968. Now, each side would purchase 200 aircraft. The French would have 3 variants, one for its Air Force, one type for their Navy, and their trainer variant. In contrast, the British Jaguars, 90 were to be built to the new S or strike standard, and the other 110 would be trainers. Naturally, these machines would need engines, and rather than go with an off-the-shelf power plant, it was decided that in the continuing spirit of cooperation, that the heart of the Jaguar was also going to be an Anglo-French creation, the Rolls-Royce Turbomeca Adore turbofan. In 1964, a year before the selection of the BR-121, Rolls-Royce and the French company Turbomeca had agreed to work jointly to develop a power plant based on the Rolls-Royce RB172, which Brigade had already selected for its BR-121 before the two sides had gotten together. However, naturally, being a French aircraft, Turbomeca had submitted their own design, the T260 Tourmalet. In the climate of cooperation, the two firms decided to combine their two designs to a degree in the RB172 T260, which, following Rolls-Royce's custom of naming their engines after British rivers, was named the Adore after a French river, very considerate of them. In 1966, Rolls-Royce Turbomeca Limited was registered in the UK with manufacturing split between Derby in England and Tarnos in France. Rolls-Royce would be responsible for fabricating the combustion chambers, turbines, mixers and other components, while Turbomeca would produce the low and high pressure compressors, the gearbox, afterburner and jet nozzle assemblies. But in its early years, however, the Adore struggled. It delivered less thrust than promised, consumed more fuel than expected and suffered persistent problems with its reheat system. Pilots soon learned the Jaguar was no rocket ship, and it gained a reputation for being underpowered, spawning the darkly comic refrain, "Good job there were two," as in 2 engines. Brilliant though the Jaguar performance proved to be in squadron service, there is no doubt that for certain battlefield close air support combat situations, it could on delivery have done with a bit more power. Pilots often described thrashing the engines hard just to keep performance respectable, particularly in hot and high conditions. The first Adore engine, the Mark 101, produced just 5,100 pounds of thrust dry, or around 7,300 in reheat. On paper, with an empty weight of 7 tons, that wasn't a bad thrust to weight ratio, but in reality where it mattered, the aircraft rarely flew clean. A typical training load put it at around 13.5 tons, and in combat configuration, that could be pushed up to 15 tons. That left it heavy, underpowered, with a relatively small wing. The shortfall in thrust was so critical that pilots routinely had to conserve every ounce of engine performance. I read that pilots often switched off pressurization altogether just to free up bleed air and wring a few more pounds of thrust from the Adores. And if one failed at low altitude, the emergency drill was to go full power on the remaining engine and under hot conditions to jettison external stores. If that failed, the checklist was brutally short: eject. Engine surges were another headache, sometimes forcing a shutdown. A few unlucky pilots found themselves in what they jokingly called the glider version of the Jaguar. But the early Mark 101 engines revealed some teething issues, particularly with afterburner stability. The Mark 101 engine could only light reheat at maximum RPM, but the Mark 102 fixed this with part throttle reheat, which allowed afterburner engagement at 85% RPM, giving pilots much needed throttle flexibility, and was used in all British Jaguars. This part throttle reheat meant that if one engine failed, especially during a landing approach where the remaining working engine would be at low throttle setting, the pilot was able to use some reheat on the good engine without having to push it to maximum RPM. This provided more control and thrust in a difficult situation, making single engine recoveries possible at higher aircraft weights. Without PTR, full reheat might be too much and maximum dry thrust not enough, leading to an excessive rate of descent, and if both engines failed, the Jaguar's glide ratio was said to be closer to that of a brick than an aircraft. Soon, after much work, she was ready for her first flight. By the time the amendment was made to the Memorandum of Understanding in January 1968 to increase the number of aircraft, the first of the 8 prototypes was ready to fly and had already started taxi trials. A total of 8 prototypes of 5 distinct variants were constructed for the Jaguar's development trials, 5 aircraft in France and 3 in Britain. The 5 variants of the aircraft were the Jaguar A, or A for appui or support, single-seat French strike aircraft, the Jaguar E for école, 2-seat French trainer, the Jaguar M for marine, single-seat French naval model, the Jaguar B or B-place, 2-seat British trainer, and the Jaguar S for strike, single-seat British strike version. From the outset, the two nations ran a joint testing program, carefully coordinated so that the workload was shared and unnecessary duplication between the French and British centres was avoided. The first of the 8 prototype Jaguars, E01, a 2-seat French trainer version, rolled out at the Brigade facility on the 17th of April 1968, where it initially underwent ground and engine tests before being dismantled and moved to the Centre d'Essai de Vol at Istres. The date for its maiden flight was subsequently held up for several weeks, partly as a result of considerable unrest and civil strife in France during the summer of 1968, when a state of near revolution existed for a short time. So it wasn't until the 8th of September 1968 that a Jaguar flew for the first time, when Bernard Witt, Brigade's chief test pilot, lifted off at 9:20 AM and climbed to 17,000 feet. On landing, after a flight of just 25 minutes, Witt said, "The Jaguar flies very well, I had no problems." Within just a few sorties, E01 had gone supersonic and was being regularly flown not only by Brigade, but also by Jimmy Dell, BAC's lead test pilot. This aircraft was mainly used for aerodynamic trials and systems evaluation. The second French prototype, another two-seater E02, followed on the 11th of February 1969, also flown by Witt, and was tasked with engine and performance testing. Soon after, the single-seat Jaguar A03 took to the skies on the 29th of March, followed by A04 on the 27th of May. A03 focused on navigation and attack system development, while A04 was dedicated to weapons carriage and firing trials. The final French prototype, Jaguar M05, first flew in November 1969 as a naval development aircraft with Brigade's Jack Jesberger as the controls. By then, Britain had joined the flight test program. The first UK prototype, Jaguar S06 X-Ray Whiskey 560, a single-seater, made its maiden flight from Wharton on the 12th of November 1969, flown by Jimmy Dell, going supersonic on its maiden flight. Another single-seat machine, S07 X-Ray Whiskey 563, flew in June 1970 and was used for testing the navigation and tack system destined for RAF service. Overall, the test program went smoothly, with only one major setback in March 1970, when the first prototype E01 was lost in an accident. Even so, as testing progressed, a development had taken place within the French aircraft industry, which was to alter the Anglo-French relationship and have deep implications for the Jaguar. In a significant move, Brigade had begun to be merged with Dassault as early as 1967, with the merger completed by 1971. At this time, the production order had been increased to 400 Jaguars. For now, Dassault was not going to argue about that, because it meant money coming in. But the last thing he wanted was for this little aeroplane, the philosophy of which he did not agree with, spilling over into the export market and becoming a rival for any future export sales, where he was having a fine old time selling Mirages. The paradox was thus created, in which one of the partners in the Jaguar program had become a potential competitor in any future attempt to sell the aircraft, and when it came down to it, Dassault was in no mood to share the spoils of anyone. It was to be 100% profit from his creations, rather than 50% of the profits from the Jaguar. However, the Jaguar program continued without any serious effort from the French side to dismantle what was going to be potentially a very successful project. Well, for the time being at least. In Britain, a change of plans now called for a reassessment of types. Instead of 110 trainers and 90 strike aircraft, it was now changed to be 165 single-seat strike Jaguars and only 35 trainers. This effectively ended the Jaguar's role as a pure advanced trainer for RAF service, with that job later being filled by the BAE Hawk, while the RAF two-seat Jaguars were to be used primarily as operational trainers for pilots who were posted to Jaguar squadrons. The French Navy had its own plans for the Jaguar. Of the aircraft allocated to France, 40 were destined to become a dedicated maritime strike variant, the Jaguar M, the M4 Marine. To survive the punishment of carrier operations, its undercarriage was beefed up to take landing impacts of up to 19 feet per second, nearly double that of the land-based versions. That's some heroic suspension. With twin nose wheels and single main wheels, and an arrestor hook that was stressed up to a brutal 5.5 G. A reinforced airframe allowed it to withstand catapult launches, while a 0-0 ejection seat gave the pilot a fighting chance even in the worst conditions. This carrier-capable Jaguar, intended as a successor to the Dassault Intendard 4, had successfully completed a range of trials, including deck landings at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Bedford and operational tests on board the French carrier Clemenceau. Despite these positive results, the French Navy shifted focus to alternative carrier aircraft, examining options such as the American McDonnell Douglas A4 Skyhawk and the Vought A7 Corsair II. Not only that, but the program came under constant attack from Dassault, who was keen to protect his own designs. In 1972, the order for the M variant was finally cancelled and replaced with an updated version of the Intendard. Officially, the French cited dissatisfaction with the single-engine approach of the aircraft, though without any hint of shame since they replaced it with an equally single-engine Super Intendard. In truth, Dassault's growing dominance following its merger with Breguet made the decision politically convenient. It kept all the money in-house, built more Intendards and more work for the French. It suited the French Ministry of Defense budget and neatly sidelined a potential rival. So following the cancellation of the French naval Jaguar, production for both nations was confined to the tactical Jaguar A and S variants and the two-seat B and E trainers. Manufacturing responsibilities were divided as evenly as possible between the partners. Dassault Breguet plants at Biarritz and Toulouse produced the forward and center fuselage sections, while BAC's military aircraft division handled the rear fuselage, wings and tail assembly and air intakes. The completed components were shipped to the partner nation, where each side had its final assembly line. In both the UK and France, these dedicated facilities brought together the British and French built sections to complete the aircraft. Structurally, the Jaguar was, to say the least, robust, with an aluminium alloy airframe reinforced by titanium in the hot areas, stressed for 8.6 G with a maximum tolerance of 12 G. Perhaps one of the Jaguar's most distinctive and practical pieces of kit was its undercarriage. Designed by the French, the Jaguar stands relatively high off the ground, which was deliberately oversized and rugged, built to cope with rough fields and improvised runways. The main gear used twin wheels with low pressure tyres splayed outwards to give a wide track, while the nose gear carried a single wheel. All of it was built to take a beating, able to absorb all sorts of heavy landings and what one engineer called tremendous thumps, up to about 1500 feet per minute descent rate. The retraction sequence was clever too. The nose gear swung backwards while the main gear folded forwards, rotating 90 degrees to lie flat within the fuselage. Does anyone else think that the Jaguar looks like a bird of prey that's about to snatch up a fish? Over time, the nose wheel door design evolved from a short panel with twin landing lights to a full-length three-door setup starting with the later prototypes. Landing a Jaguar was never a gentle affair, especially when heavy, with speeds often approaching 170 knots. In such conditions, the brake chute was more than just a convenience, it was a necessity. On icy or snow-covered strips such as those at Bardufoss in Norway, it could instantly shed 40 to 50 knots of speed. Similarly, at locations like Gibraltar, where the 6,000-foot runway offered little margin for error and ended abruptly in water, the parachute was deployed as a matter of routine. The system, however, came with its quirks. Once used, the chute had to be collected from the end of the runway and repacked, a very unpopular job among the ground crew. On detachments away from home base, pilots sometimes carried a spare chute and attempted to pack it themselves. The results, as you can imagine, were mixed at best. More often than not, the chute either stayed firmly packed when it was deployed, or tumbled uselessly onto the runway, forcing pilots to rely entirely on their brakes. Another issue was the chute container itself. If not fitted securely, it had the unfortunate tendency to jettison under heavy G-forces or during turbulent low-level sorties. Stories circulated of abandoned containers littering the Scottish Highlands. To assist with the braking even further, a pair of powerful perforated air brakes were located ahead of the ventral fins under the wings. These were particularly useful on short-field landings on snowy runways. Plus, there was an arrestor hook fitted between the engine exhausts, and this was generally used for emergency landings. Using it above 50 knots, though, required structural checks. In 1973, Jaguar GR1 X-Ray 109 became the unlikely star of a very interesting experiment. With the M55 motorway near Blackpool still unopened, they found a straight stretch of tarmac which offered the perfect stand-in for a wartime dispersal strip. BAC test pilot Tim Ferguson brought his aircraft down in a landing roll of barely 450 yards. On the ground, crews quickly loaded 4 cluster bombs and fuel tanks. Moments later, Ferguson lit the afterburners and their Jaguar was airborne again in just 600 yards. Remarkably, the motorway surface showed no damage, despite the aircraft weighing 7 tons empty, which is not really surprising given the aircraft's light footprint and low-pressure tyres. The success of that first demonstration led to more ambitious trials. In April 1975, when a Jaguar was used repeatedly for landings and takeoffs on the same motorway, These exercises proved that the aircraft could operate from improvised strips, a valuable capability in the Cold War when planners worried that Europe's air bases would be high on any enemy target list. The high-mounted wings and intakes combined with the tall gear gave excellent ground clearance and kept the engines safe from debris and allowed armourers to work upright underneath, a big advantage for rapid turnarounds where access to the engine could be had without a ladder. On the ground, there is easy access for maintenance and overhaul of internal equipment for a large number of exterior panels which can be opened to reveal the Jaguar's engines, internal systems and plumbing for most routine maintenance tasks. In theory, an engine could be changed in 30 minutes and a Jaguar could be rearmed and refueled in about 25. There were quirks, of course. The big landing gear produced a lot of drag, so on single engine approaches it was often left up until the last moment with part throttle reheat needed just to stay airborne. The Jaguar's relatively small high-mounted 40-degree swept wings were built for a purpose. These gave the aircraft and pilots a smoother, more stable ride at low level, ideal to handle the turbulence from skimming cows at less than 100 feet. With a wing loading of almost 650 kilograms per square meter, 3 times that of a Hunter, made the Jaguar extremely stable on the deck, but this came at a cost. Its turning performance, especially with bombs and tanks fitted, was miserable, giving rise to the joke that its turn rate needed to be measured with a calendar. One of the Jaguar's most distinctive features was its full-span flaps and leading-edge slats to provide adequate lift at lower speeds. This meant that instead of conventional ailerons, the Jaguar used spoilers on the top surface of each wing for roll control. And to improve roll control further, especially during low-speed flight, the Jaguar's large all-moving tailplane was designed to operate with differential movement. This system used a variable gearing mechanism that gave maximum effect at slower speeds that progressively reduced its input as airspeed increased, becoming inactive altogether once the aircraft exceeded 420 knots. The Big Cat, as the Jaguar became known, was not the easiest aircraft to fly and had many quirks to keep their pilots on their toes. One of them was the spine bending. During high G maneuvers, it was discovered that the wings would deflect upwards and the fuselage would bend down at the nose and tail, causing the spine to lengthen, especially when the aircraft was heavily loaded. This spine bending would stretch the spine of the aircraft, where control rods for the rudder and tailplane were located, causing unintended rudder and tailplane inputs above 4G. To fix this, a spine bending compensator was integrated into the aircraft's auto-stabilization systems, where a yaw damper applied the necessary rudder deflection to prevent yaw, while the pitch auto-stabilizer did the same for the tailplane. But it didn't end there. Listening to many pilots' interviews and reading lots of accounts, one of the worst characteristics of the aircraft had to have been its high angle of attack performance, which was described as having a hard flight envelope boundary. Like many aircraft with highly swept wings, the Jaguar didn't behave like a conventional aeroplane when pushed to the edge of its flight envelope. What I mean by this is that it never really stalled in the traditional sense. The wing would keep on generating lift beyond 30 degrees of angle of attack, but long before reaching that point, the airframe would begin to misbehave. The Jaguar was fitted with an audible AOA warning system, a little voice of impending doom to remind the pilots not to cross that boundary, which, as they approached the limits, directional stability would start to erode, the wings would rock uncontrollably, and soon after the aircraft entered what was described as a yo-yo or some crazy fairground ride that ended up in a crash. If the pilot was inexperienced or a heavy-handed flyer, the breakdown was sudden and violent, providing no buffer or pre-stalled buffet warning. The Jaguar would snap into violent gyrations, leaving no chance to recover before hitting the ground, and it was this trait that gave the aircraft its fearsome reputation. In the wrong hands, it was lethal. Several were lost while flying at low level, where recovery margins were vanishingly small. In a single-seat GR1, a full recovery from departure could eat up more than 15,000 feet of altitude, a luxury no pilot had when skimming only a few hundred feet above the ground. The two-seat T2 with its taller canopy and altered aerodynamics was even more treacherous. Instructors made it clear to students, under most conditions, if they lost control, they wouldn't be coming back. And to drive the lesson home, ground school included a sobering film of a Jaguar spin trials. The footage was unforgettable, a jet tumbling end over end, engines flamed out, fuel vapour streaming from the intakes. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's helmet snapped from side to side as the machine bucked and rolled in complete disarray. It was a brutal demonstration that grabbed every student's attention. Recovery drills were taught in theory only. It was far too dangerous to practice. The first step was always the same: unload the wing by easing the stick to neutral in the hope of calming the gyrations. Next came the critical task of checking speed and angle of attack. Above 170 knots, with the nose hunting between 50 and 250 degrees, the aircraft was likely in auto-rotation, which in that case, gentle back pressure could slow the rotation, but pushing the stick forward only made things worse. But the hardest recovery procedure advice was, hands off the stick, wait and hope. Pilots were taught one absolute: if the jet was still out of control below 10,000 feet, the only answer was ejection. And even after a successful recovery, the pilots would find themselves in the glider version of the Jaguar, as the door engines almost always flamed out during a spin. For many, the first impression of the Jaguar is that it had a very angular, boxy look, like it was built from Legos, with those squared off air intakes which were placed high on the airframe to reduce the risk of ingesting small animals when operating from rough strips. The fuselage was given an area-ruled cross-section which involved pinching it in the middle like a wasp waist. This significantly reduced drag, particularly when approaching and exceeding Mach 1. One of the defining qualities of the Jaguar was its avionics, particularly the navigation and attack systems, which transformed it into a highly capable strike aircraft. Here, however, the British and French models diverged significantly. The most sophisticated and most costly version was the British Jaguar S, which entered service as the Jaguar GR Mark I. Its two-seat counterpart, the Jaguar B, carried much of the same navigation and attack suite and entered service as the Jaguar T Mark II. The standard avionics across these British models included VHF, UHF and HF radios, ILS, IFF, TACAN, a Smiths Industries heads-up display, the first RAF aircraft to have one, and a horizontal situation indicator. But at the heart of the package was Marconi's NAVWAS, or Navigation and Weapon Aiming Subsystem, which was a nifty piece of kit which integrated a digital computer to all manner of inertial sensors and gyros that fed everything into a navigation control unit and a projected map display. The system was regarded as one of the most advanced attack avionics suites of its day. We will come back to these systems in a bit. The British GR Mark I was also fitted with a Ferranti laser ranger and target seeker in the nose, giving the aircraft its distinctive chisel-shaped profile. As you can imagine, the cockpit was a very busy affair with all these systems. The French Jaguars carried simpler avionics, but they were more than capable aircraft with digital navigation computers and a Dassault fire control computer for their Martel missiles. Armament was also different between the two nations. The GR Mark I had a pair of 30mm Aden cannon beneath the cockpit, while the French Jaguar A and E carried two 30mm Defa cannon in the same position, whereas I must point out that the British T Mark II had only a single Aden cannon. Externally, all models could carry up to 10,000 pounds or 4,500 kilos of stores, giving the trainers nearly the same operational punch as the strike versions when required. Power, as we know, came from the Rolls-Royce Turbomeca Adore engines with afterburners. The first production standard was the Adore Mark 102, producing 5,115 pounds of dry thrust and 7,305 pounds in reheat that gave the Jaguars a top speed of 1,056 miles an hour and a climb to 30,000 feet in just 90 seconds, topping out at 45,000 feet. Fuel capacity was around 4,200 litres, with tanks armoured in key areas to protect it from ground fire. On internal tanks alone, the Jaguar could strike targets up to 350 miles distance, with range extended to 520 miles when carrying external tanks. Not the greatest range, but the Jaguar was ideal for close air support and dashing in from airfields in West Germany at low level into Warsaw-packed countries to deliver nuclear weapons and then dash back out again. The first production aircraft to fly was the French Jaguar E-1, which took to the air on the 2nd of November 1971, again with Bernard Witt at the controls. Britain's first production Jaguar, a GR Mark I X-Ray 108, flew on the 11th of October 1972, while the first British two-seater flew on the 28th of March 1973. By this stage, production lines in both countries were running at full pace, and the Jaguar was on the verge of entering operational service. The Jaguar's first frontline home was with the French Armée de l'Air, with the aircraft officially entering squadron service with the 7th Escadron de Chasse Provence, who took delivery of the new Jaguars on the 19th of June 1973. Confidence in its capabilities was high. So high that almost from the moment the Jaguar entered French service, it became more than just another strike aircraft. It was to be the tip of the spear of French power projection. In the former colonies of Africa, where fragile governments often found themselves threatened by insurgencies or regional rivals, the Jaguar was sent time and again as both a weapon and a display of strength. The French Air Force came to call this policy la diplomatie de Jaguar, or Jaguar diplomacy, a modern-day form of gunboat diplomacy, a doctrine built on the knowledge that nothing demonstrated Paris's resolve quite like a squadron of supersonic jets roaring overhead. Rugged, reliable, and able to operate from improvised strips under the harshest conditions, the Jaguar proved perfectly suited for the African theatre. For the Desert Wars, it was even given a new coat of paint, its standard grey-green swapped for a disruptive sand and chocolate camouflage. The Jaguar's combat baptism came in December 1977 during Operation Lamantin in Mauritania, when French Jaguars flying out of Dakar in Senegal struck at the Polisario Front guerrillas who, backed by Algeria, were mounting attacks across the desert. The campaign was short and costly. 2 Jaguars were shot down in December 1977, and a third was lost in May 1978 during yet another strike, just before Mauritania abandoned its claims and the war drew to a close. Barely had those jets returned home before France found itself embroiled in Chad, where civil war threatened to upend the region. In April 1978, as part of Operation Taku, 2,000 French troops were sent into central Chad, supported by helicopters and Jaguars. In May and June, the Jaguars helped blunt an offensive launched by rebels. Their strikes routed enemy forces and helping to stabilize the front, yet the Jaguar was not immune. 1 Jaguar was shot down, however her pilot was rescued. Others were lost in a reconnaissance flight in August, a mid-air collision later that month, and another crash in October, 4 aircraft gone in 6 months. The war in Chad dragged on into the 1980s, with France once again turning to its Jaguars during Operation Manta in 1983. Operating from the Central African Republic, the Jaguars struck harder enemy forces on the 25th of January 1984 when they intercepted a rebel column. However, during the attack, a Jaguar was brought down by 23mm gunfire. Its pilot, Captain Michel Crocky, ejected but was too low to survive. A very sober reminder of the risks France's airmen carried in Africa's endless wars. Though French forces withdrew later that year under a de-escalation agreement, Libyan interference in Chad never ceased, ensuring that the Jaguars would return. And that return came in 1986 with Operation Epivier. This time the Jaguars struck with greater force. On the 16th of February, a package of 11 Jaguars, escorted by Mirage F-1s and supported by tankers and Brigade Atlantics, roared north to smash the Libyan-built airfield at Wadi Doum, dropping anti-runway munitions, cratering the strip, leaving it unusable for days. A year later, on the 7th of January 1987, the Jaguars struck once again, destroying a Libyan radar site with a Martel missile. But in one tragic incident, on the 27th of March 1986, a Jaguar crashed on takeoff after experiencing engine failure. Its pilot ejected safely, but the aircraft ploughed into a school, taking the lives of 21 and injuring 30. From Mauritania to Chad, from rebel columns to Libyan airfields, the Jaguar became France's weapon of choice in Africa, a machine that could be deployed quickly, endure primitive conditions, and deliver decisive blows. Its reputation as a rugged and adaptable aircraft gave real weight to the phrase Jaguar diplomacy. The Jaguar story didn't start and end with the RAF and the French Armée de l'Air. There was a further development of the aircraft created for the export market known as the Jaguar International. This export version was to be all things to all customers, for all sorts of roles and climates, and covered everything that wasn't destined for the British or French Air Forces. BAC had ambitious export plans with visions of the skies darkened with swarms of Jaguars. However, despite these grand plans, they had to contend with a very French fly in the ointment.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
Even though there was no reason why the Jaguar couldn't have served with dozens of air forces around the world, when Dassault absorbed Breguet in the mid-1970s, the French enthusiasm for pushing the Jaguar exports quickly evaporated. Dassault had every incentive to promote its own Mirage line, where it retained complete control and profit, rather than splitting the sales with its SEPECAT partner. As a result, a majority of the responsibility fell to the British Aircraft Corporation to carry the Jaguar International to market. To this end, Wharton became the hub for development, trials and export demonstrations, with a dedicated sales team to show off the aircraft's flexibility to prospective buyers. The Farnborough Air Show of 1974 marked the official launch of the export Jaguar, and in the years that followed, the Jaguar would be flown on an exhaustive demonstration tour, particularly in the Middle East, where Air Force bigwigs were shopping for modern strike fighters. BAC had every reason to be optimistic. Even before its official debut, the Jag had attracted a lot of international interest. The question was, were they cash buyers or time-wasting tire kickers? Initially, BAC tried to sell the Jaguar International to the four-nation consortium of Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway and Denmark, which had been formed to find a standard aircraft to replace their F-104G starfighters. At the same time, Sweden naturally pushed their splendid Viggen, the Americans pitched the F-16, and of course Dassault went in hawking their F-1. Of course, the Jaguar couldn't compete in a fighter role, but it could easily fit into the attack one as well as the air defense role, for which the Jaguar was more than suited than both the F-1 and the F-16, and vastly superior than any other aircraft available within the time and price range. So someone had the brilliantly logical idea to propose that the Jaguar re-equip the attack squadrons, while the F-1, in extensive use to the French Air Force, would re-equip the interceptor squadrons. This was a great idea, and even though France was not part of NATO, it would have been easy to develop and equip NATO air forces, but this proposal failed, and I think at this point we can all guess why. This otherwise excellent proposal failed for two main reasons. The first was, Dassault refused to cooperate with BAC. He was convinced that he would secure the entire four-nation order for the F-1 and had no interest in sharing it with anyone else, despite holding a 50% stake in the Jag. The second was that the French government's defense sales organization supported this stance. They wanted it all for France, nothing for the roast beefs.
No, now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
But France's greed and overreach lost them the deal, ultimately opening the European market to the F-16, which the four nations eventually purchased. But I must add that here, the attitude of the British Defence Sales Organisation in Whitehall did very little to promote the Jaguar. I read that their approach ranged from lukewarm to almost to the point of hostility. As a footnote, Belgium nearly joined the Jaguar program in the late 1960s with a tentative requirement for 100 aircraft, but ultimately turned instead to the Mirage 5, so Dassault did manage to wet his beak. West Germany too considered the Jaguar as a starfighter successor before deciding to wait for the multinational Tornado. Switzerland evaluated the aircraft alongside 8 other contenders, and BAC even went so far as to design a collapsible tail fin so the Jaguar could fit inside the Swiss Air Force's underground hangars. On the other side of the globe, Japan expressed a strong interest, but these plans failed in part because of the high royalty payments sought by SEPECAT. Japan ultimately went on to pursue its own indigenous design, the Mitsubishi F1, a machine that bore a striking resemblance to the Jaguar. The sales tours became an industry in themselves. In 1969, a SEPECAT team toured South America, pitching the idea of a maritime Jaguar M for Brazil and Argentina. Elsewhere, Kuwait initially ordered 50 Jaguars and 16 Mirage 5s, but instead chose the Mirage F1. It was unfortunate. During this time, the Jaguar was only in the early stages of operational service with the RAF in Germany and hadn't had the opportunity to demonstrate its remarkable capabilities in attack, interdiction and tactical reconnaissance. The Jaguar would later prove its excellence by dominating international NATO tactical competitions and putting on a real show at the American Red Flag exercises in the Nevada desert, which we'll come to later on. There was also an ambitious sales drive to Australia and New Zealand, which gave rise to the AA-107 concept nicknamed Son of Jaguar, a proposed trainer with a single reheated Adore engine with variable swept wings. BAC engineers claimed its performance would have been spectacular, but the project collapsed when the British government declined to fund the development. These efforts showed both the determination of BAC's export arm and the adaptability of the Jaguar airframe, but the cash register wouldn't start ringing until the mid-1970s. What was being offered to foreign buyers was not a watered-down machine. On the contrary, the Jaguar International was a package that in many ways surpassed its British and French cousins. At the heart of these export machines was the power plant. These aircraft were fitted with the Adore Mark 804 or Mark 811 engines, both more powerful than the early RAF Mark 102s. For instance, the Mark 804 produced around 5,320 pounds dry thrust and 8,040 pounds with afterburner, which was some 27% more power than the original Adore at low altitude and high subsonic speed. The Mark 811, the preferred engine for later deliveries, pushed this further to 5,520 pounds dry and 8,400 pounds with reheat. For operators flying in high and hot environments such as India or Ecuador, this extra thrust gave them greater flexibility regarding wall load and, importantly, mission endurance. But equally important was the choice of weapons cleared for export. While RAF Jaguars initially carried conventional bombs, BL-755 cluster munitions and rockets, the international model was marketed as a truly multi-role platform. Now air forces could equip it with Sidewinder or Matra Magic air-to-air missiles, providing incredible air defense without sacrificing strike load. More significantly, the Jaguar International could be configured for maritime strike, a role lost when the French Navy's carrier-borne Jaguar M was cancelled. With the optional Thompson CSF AGAV radar fitted in the nose, the Jaguar gained the ability to guide heavyweight anti-ship weapons such as the BAE Sea Eagle, Exocet, Harpoon or Cormorant missiles. This flexibility made it attractive to smaller nations that needed a single aircraft to cover air defense, strike and even anti-shipping duties. Even the avionic fits were tailored to the customer requirements, and the plug-and-play philosophy became a hallmark of the Jaguar International. Navigation and attack systems ranged from improved versions of the NavWAS computer to French and British hybrid fits incorporating SAGEM inertial navigation, Ferranti COMED map attack displays, and even low-light TV sensors. The AGAV radar package, when installed, was linked with a Ferranti laser ranger, giving the aircraft a credible all-weather multi-role capability that rivaled contemporary Mirages and F-16s. But despite all these bells and whistles, BAC were always fighting an uphill struggle against the Dassault's Mirage family in the export market. It was even said that during marketing meetings, Dassault were asked, "How come you're trying to sell a Mirage F1 against the Jaguar?" And they used to reply, "But what about the Lightning?" Despite the Lightning being out of production at this time. Nevertheless, Wharton continued to push hard, and by the late 1970s, Jaguar International had secured orders from 4 overseas customers: Oman, Ecuador, Nigeria, and most significantly, India. Oman was the first to commit, signing in 1974 for a dozen aircraft, 10 single-seat Jaguar OS strike fighters and 2 OB trainers fitted with the Adore Mark 804s. Deliveries began in 1977, and by 1980 a second batch of 12 followed, now with improved Adore Mark 811 engines, creating 2 Jaguar squadrons of Fummer 8. The Sultan's Air Force used the type in a dual strike and air defense role, unusual for Jaguars elsewhere. The early Omani machines mounted over-wing rails for Matra Magic missiles, while later aircraft adapted their outboard pylons for AIM-9P sidewinders in an attempt to turn them into interceptors. These Omani Jaguars carried on until they were withdrawn from service in 2014. However, the first export deliveries actually went to Ecuador, which signed its contract in 1974 and received 12 aircraft, 10 single-seaters and 2 twin-seaters in 1977. The ferry flights from Wharton across the Atlantic to the Andes were themselves a test of endurance, relying on the Jaguar's long-range navigation kit. Once in service, Ecuadorian Jaguars faced some of the harshest operating conditions of any fleet: hot and humid coastal bases and high altitude strips in the mountains. And yet they proved resilient, and during the Pasquia conflict of 1981, Jaguars flew border patrols with some ground strike operations, while in the Condor War of 1995 they were held in reserve as a deterrent. Ecuador retired their fleet in 2003. Nigeria placed an order in 1983 for 18 Jaguars, 13 single-seat SNs and 5 BN trainers, the end for Nigeria, with deliveries following soon after, but the timing couldn't have been worse. A coup at the end of the year toppled the civilian government which had signed the contract. Then, budgetary difficulties and shifting political priorities saw the Nigerian Jaguars grounded and eventually withdrawn from service in the early 1990s, with some being offered up for resale. By far the most significant export success, and the one that would define the Jaguar, was India. In 1978, after a grueling 12-year evaluation for its deep penetration strike aircraft program, the Indian Air Force announced that the Jaguar had beaten the Saab Vighan and the Dassault Mirage F1. It was a decision of both strategic and industrial weight. India had insisted on local production, and the contract signed that October was worth over £1 billion, the largest defence deal India had ever undertaken. The agreement provided for 40 aircraft to be built by SEPECAT in Europe, 45 more assembled from British kits at Hindustan Aeronautics in Bangalore, and eventually more than 120 to be fully manufactured in India. To bridge the gap while production ramped up, the RAF loaned India 18 Jaguars, single-seaters and trainers that had previously worn British roundels. Indian pilots trained on these borrowed aircraft, and by 1980 the first indigenous squadrons, numbers 5 and 14, were declared operational. From this point on, the Jaguar became known locally as the Shamshar, or Sword of Justice. Indian-built Jaguars flew with the Adore Mark 811 engines, better suited to India's hot and high operating conditions, and progressively received modern avionics, including the Segem Ulyss inertial navigation system, Smith's head-up display, and Ferranti Comed electronic displays. Some were explicitly configured for maritime strike, able to fire the Seagull anti-ship missiles. The Indian Jaguar has outlasted every other operator, including the RAF and the French Armée de l'Air. Through successive upgrades, including digital cockpits, modern targeting pods, and eventually further radar improvements, the Shamshar has remained a frontline asset. And these Jaguars have not been idle, being used for reconnaissance missions in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s, to precision bombing in the Kargil War of 1999, and reported strikes during the 2025 India-Pakistan conflict, when Indian Jaguars hit 11 military air bases across Pakistan in a coordinated, precision-led campaign using Rampage missiles. Taken together, the Jaguar International program, with its improved engines, flexible weapon fits and adaptable avionics, gave smaller nations access to a credible strike fighter with a true multi-role potential. The fact that the Jaguar still flies in India is nothing short of spectacular, and I hope to one day be able to visit India and see these aircraft flying firsthand. The Jaguar finally entered RAF service in 1973, first at RAF Lozimath, before expanding to RAF Germany, where it flew strike and reconnaissance missions. Its squadrons were assigned both nuclear and conventional roles to counter a potential Soviet advance across West Germany's plains. The first aircraft, serial X-Ray X-Ray 111, arrived at Lozimath on the 30th of May 1973 for ground troop training, and by 1974 the type was operational, with RAF Coltishall established as the UK hub, while RAF Germany fielded the largest Jaguar force. At Lozimath, the Jaguar Operational Conversion Unit trained crews in low-level navigation, weapons delivery and electronic warfare around Scotland's hills and valleys before being redesignated No. 226 OCU in October 1974. Assignment to a Jaguar squadron in the 1970s and 80s was a coveted posting. Because of its limitations and reputation as a dangerous aircraft to fly, those who were chosen to fly the Jag needed a high level of skill and were expected to master low-level flying, weapons delivery and reconnaissance, often in very demanding conditions that were designed to simulate the high-threat environment of Central Europe, particularly against Soviet air defences. 3 UK squadrons, No. 54, 6 and 41, formed at Coltishall between 1974 and 1977 under No. 1 Group, RAF Strike Command. No. 54 was declared Jaguar ready in June 1974 and combat ready by January 1975, with No. 6 following later in 1974 and 41 in 77, the later specialising in tactical reconnaissance with Vinten pods and Arctic training. These squadrons handle strike and reconnaissance roles with transport aircraft in support for rapid overseas deployments. Meanwhile, in RAF Germany, the Jaguar equipped 4 strike squadrons at RAF Bruggen, No. 14, 17, 31 and 20, plus No. 2 Army Cooperation Squadron at RAF Larbrook, for dedicated reconnaissance employing rotating camera pods and a British Aerospace infrared line scan system for low visibility work. Each Bruggen squadron typically maintained between 12 and 16 aircraft, including the T-2 trainer, replacing Phantoms to free them for air defence. By the late 1970s, RAF Germany operated approximately 70 Jaguars, combining GR1s and T-2 trainers across these units. A key piece of kit fitted to the Jaguar was its navigation and weapons aiming subsystem, or just NAVWAS. An advanced avionics suite designed to help pilots navigate at low level and deliver weapons with precision. When it entered service in the early 1970s, NAVWAS was regarded as one of the most sophisticated digital navigation and attack systems in the world. At its heart was an inertial navigation system, a box full of gyroscopes and accelerometers that tracked the aircraft's movement. This data fed into the Marconi Elliott MCS92CM processing unit, the so-called 8KB computer. By modern standards, that's minuscule, memory-wise roughly enough to store a Word document, but by the early 1970s that was cutting edge. It processed inputs from 14 separate systems, driving the moving map, the head-up display and the weapon aiming calculations. In effect, this tiny digital brain turned the Jaguar into a high-speed, low-level bomber capable of remarkable precision. The most visible output was the head-up display, the first ever fitted to a purpose-built RAF aircraft, Buccaneer notwithstanding. It projected vital flight and targeting information onto a glass panel right in front of the pilot's eyes, allowing them to keep looking outside while flying and aiming. To improve bombing accuracy, Jaguars also carried a laser rangefinder and marked target seeker in their distinctive chisel-shaped nose. Another innovation was the moving map display, which showed the aircraft's position as a symbol flying over a projected map. This was, needless to say, very helpful for navigating extreme low levels over the featureless Central European and Soviet terrain. However, the Jaguar didn't have a ground-following radar like the later Tornado. The pilots were literally the low-level radar, manually flying and controlling the height and speed themselves when skimming just a few hundred feet above the ground. An exhausting task, no doubt, especially in poor weather. The Jaguars erased some of the workload, but it never replaced the need for quick reactions and faster hands. When functioning properly, Jaguars gave the Jaguar impressive accuracy. In some modes, bombs could be delivered with such precision that crews could put one in a bucket. Crucially, the accuracy of the system allowed a single-pass fast low-level attack without switching on the radar. This meant that the Jaguars could fly to the target without alerting the defenders of their approach. In this manner, the pilots could arrive over the target, drop their bombs and be back home for tea and medals before the enemy knew what had hit them. This combination made the Jaguars practically unstoppable, but the system had its flaws. The computer was small and easily overloaded. Selecting a weapon could freeze the moving map until release. The inertial navigation system drifted over time, meaning calculated positions could be miles off after an hour of flying, forcing pilots to make manual corrections. Data entry was slow and fiddly, requiring endless button presses to load waypoints. And reliability was a constant headache. The system could dump mid-mission, leaving the pilot to fall back on simpler instruments and old-fashioned map reading. Even so, NavWAS was a major step forward for the RAF. It demonstrated how digital avionics could transform navigation and weapons delivery, even if the technology of the time struggled to keep up with the ambition. From 1983 onwards, the system was gradually replaced with the more reliable Ferranti Fin 1064 inertial navigation system, which finally delivered the reliability together with the accuracy Jaguar crews needed. In many ways, NavWAS was like an early GPS, groundbreaking for its time, full of promise but prone to glitches. While many associate the Jaguar as a strike aircraft, it was equally critical in reconnaissance. From the outset, RAF Jaguars could carry a large sense-line reconnaissance pod, often nicknamed the Barge. Inside the pod was a suite of film cameras and an infrared line scan system that could build a continuous heat map of the ground below, which meant that even vehicles hidden under camouflage often showed up clearly, their engines glowing against the cooler terrain. Here, the NavWAS again came into play. Every strip of film carried altitude, speed, position, and time data, making it possible for photographic interpreters to pin down exactly where and when each image had been taken. The system also drove a motion compensation device that kept pictures sharp despite the Jaguar racing along at hundreds of knots at treetop height. For the pilot, reconnaissance flying was demanding work, often flown solo with hours of planning required before each mission. In flight, to take the pictures, they could either fly slightly offset for better coverage or fly directly overhead if needed, pressing the event button on the throttle to mark targets for the analysts back home. By the late 1980s, it was carrying long-range photography pods capable of capturing fine detail from medium altitude. And later upgrades brought in digital electro-optical sensors, night vision capability, and advanced pods like Israel's Lightning. French Jaguars also flew reconnaissance missions, though with less sophisticated equipment, often relying on Mirage escorts to help with navigation. Still, by the end of its career, the Jaguar had become a capable all-weather intelligence gathering machine, providing commanders with sharp imagery for both pre-strike planning and post-strike assessment. But at its core, the Jaguar was still a strike aircraft, and this is where it earned its reputation. In the Cold War, its bread and butter role was nuclear strike, with 4 RAF squadrons in Germany dedicated to carrying the British WE-177 tactical nuke. These missions were planned as single aircraft sorties, often flown at very low level at high speed, relying on NavWAS to deliver the jet to its target on time and on course. NATO planners assumed heavy losses in any conventional war, but the expectation was that enough Jaguars would survive to deliver their nuclear payloads if the Cold War turned hot. Beyond this nuclear mission, the Jaguar became a versatile tactical bomber. It flew battlefield interdiction, close air support, and offensive counter-air operations, carrying everything from conventional 1,000-pound bombs to BL-755 cluster munition, rockets, and later laser-guided weapons. Its distinctive overwing pylons freed space under the wings for heavy loads by allowing Sidewinder missiles to be carried above. Whatever the loadout, the tactics were the same. High speed, low level penetration, the Jaguar flying in at 450 knots, often just a few hundred feet off the ground. Survivability was also a constant concern. Despite ECM pods and 2 engines, operating at the forward edge of the battle area was expected to incur heavy losses. In fact, NATO planners anticipated losing a third of the Jaguar force to deliver 56 nuclear bombs. That's the grim reality that shaped both the tactics and training. But by 1984, the Panavia Tornado with greater range and power began to replace the Jaguars in RAF Germany, completing the transition by 1989. The Jaguar force consolidated at Coltishall, where number 54, 6 and 41 continued in the strike and reconnaissance roles. From its 1973 debut at Lozimuth to its peak in Germany, the Jaguar, despite what the NATO planners had predicted, would have proved a real problem for any advancing Soviet meat wave, dashing in, dropping its tactical nukes and dashing back out. As one pilot said, the Jaguar was no speed demon, but it got us through. How effective the Jaguar would have been was demonstrated in the numerous red flag exercises when in 1976, a mere year after the red flag exercise had kicked off, RAF Jaguars stormed into Nevada. 8 Jaguar GR1s from RAF Germany crossed the Atlantic, 5 from 31 Squadron and 3 from 17 Squadron for some classic British hooliganism. From January the 17th to February the 28th, pilots from 17, 31 and 6 squadrons joined the Blue Force at Nellis Air Force Base, teaming up with USAF F-4E Phantoms for some intense air-to-ground missions and complex attack formations. Red Flag's challenges went far beyond outwitting enemy aircraft. The Nellis Range, a sprawling 9,000 square mile area of flat scrubland, canyons and 10,000 foot snow-capped peaks, was flown hard by Jaguar pilots at speeds of over 450 knots, pushing up to 480 and 540 knots during maneuvers and sometimes going beyond 600 knots to evade simulated surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft's small swept wings ensured stability in brutal low-level turbulence at a mere 100 feet or lower that pilots had perfected at Lozimuth, where they had trained to tear across the countryside at 100 feet at 500 knots. To maintain such low altitudes, they relied on the radar altimeter or RADAL, the height which was shown in a head-up display. The Jags were also fitted with an audio warning that sounded if they dropped below a preset or bugged height. Briefings called for the setting or the bug to be set to 100 or 120 feet, but most pilots slyly dialed it into 80 feet, aiming to average 100 feet rather than treat it as a minimum. One squadron leader grumbled about this until a pilot flew his aircraft and discovered the squadron leader's RADAL set to 80 feet. No more was said about it. This low-level mastery, backed by the NAVWAS navigation system, electronic countermeasures, chaff and flares, made the Jaguars practically untouchable on the battlefield. At Lozimuth, they had developed tactics for which pilots devised one-word commands more likely to get through radio jamming, such as jink for random positive and negative G maneuvers to evade guns, or duck for diving low to foil missiles, and knickers, as in drop 'em, for releasing a 1,000-pound bomb in the face of a persistent and tenacious enemy attacker. During one simulated attack profile, a pair of Jaguars thundered across Scotland at 100 feet and 450 knots, with an aggressor Jaguar hot on their tail. For nearly an hour, the lead pilot jinked and ducked, racking up 250 counts of positive 4.5 G and 150 counts of negative 1.5 G, burning through 12 months of aircraft fatigue life in a single sortie, yet never letting the aggressor get a clean shot. The Jaguar's capabilities impressed everyone at the 1980 Red Flag exercise when 54 Squadron was tasked with striking a Red Force convoy 100 miles from base. Screaming in at high transonic speeds just 100 feet above the ground, the Jaguars arrived undetected and dropped their ordnance with pinpoint precision. The squadron completed 137 of 141 task sorties with only one air-to-air shootdown. In 1981, 54 squadrons turned heads again by shooting down 2 USAF F-15 Eagles, prompting a chastened aggressor pilot to confess, "The RAF lads part the sand and shave the rocks. They've got a cracking aeroplane, flown with gusto, and their low-level tactics are top-notch. They master terrain masking, making them devilishly hard to spot, and when we do, they're no easy kill. We face the best, and these Jaguar pilots are as good as any, better than most." In one story I came across while researching this Jaguar script, which I feel is worth recounting, involves 54 Squadron Jaguars at the 1978 Red Flag. During one run, a 4-ship Jaguar formation was bounced by an F-5 aggressor at 100 feet. The lead pilot saw the threat and called out to the rest of the flight to take evasive maneuvers. The F-5, caught in the Jaguar's slipstream, flipped upside down, vanishing into a sand cloud. Only moments later, it emerged, climbing vertically, its pilot rattled but alive. That incident spooked the F-5s into giving the Jaguars a wide berth. Red flag exercises were not without risk. In 1984, a Jaguar from 14 Squadron crashed inverted after taking evasive action from ground radar, claiming the life of a USAF exchange pilot. Takeoffs at Nellis were brutal, with scorching heat and heavy loads making takeoff rolls longer, with pilots describing the Jaguar as staggering into the air, hugging the ground to build speed, always on the edge of performance limits. Ground crews also battled the searing heat, often having to work until 3 or 4 AM to keep every Jaguar mission ready, and they remained remarkably reliable when everything except the Jags broke down. At Red Flag, the RAF pilots showed immense skill and precision. If there are any old Jag pilots watching this, all I can say is, well done lads, well done. I can imagine it really was, in every sense, licensed hooliganism. I bet it was some of the most demanding but rewarding flying of your careers. Right, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the big cat. Now, you might be wondering, hang on, what about the first Gulf War? Wasn't the Jaguar involved in Desert Storm? And you'd be right. In 1991, 12 Jaguars from Coltishall's 6, 41 and 54 squadrons, painted in that unforgettable pinkish desert camo, flew more than 600 sorties, hammering Iraqi artillery, scud launchers and bunkers. They proved their worth in spades, dodging SAMs, AAA and bringing every bit of Cold War training to bear over the sand dunes of Kuwait and Iraq. But here's the thing, the Gulf War story, it's just too big to cram in here. Honestly, trying to wedge it into this already lengthy video would be like trying to pour a full English breakfast into an espresso cup. It just won't fit and I won't be able to do it any justice. But don't worry, the Big Cat's Desert Storm chapter, it's getting its own standalone video where I can give it the attention it deserves. But for now, let's fast forward, because the Jaguar story didn't end in 1991, far from it. After the ceasefire, the RAF Cats were straight back into the fight. After the Gulf in 1992, 8 GR-1s from Coltishall deployed to Turkey for Operation Warden, patrolling Iraq's no-fly zones. Flying in pairs, they kept a watchful eye on SAM sites, airfields and barracks, taking photos which were analysed by coalition intelligence. And on occasion, pilots swapped their recce gear for live ordnance, a subtle reminder to Mr. Hussein that the RAF's presence was more than just symbolic. One pilot later joked, "Baghdad's welcome was all flak and no tea." That same year, 12 GR-1As from No. 6 Squadron were sent to Italy for Operation Grapple, from where they launched hundreds of reconnaissance sorties over Bosnia. By the time the operation wound down, the Jags had flown over 3,000 missions and logged more than 5,000 hours without a single aircraft lost to enemy fire. By 1995, the stakes had risen. Operation Deliberate Force demanded precision in the skies above Sarajevo. 6 Jaguars from 6, 41 and 54 squadrons hunted Bosnian Serb targets. A standout moment came when a 41 Squadron GR-1B, equipped with a new laser designator pod used for guiding bombs with pinpoint precision, executed the RAF's first bombing raid in Europe since 1945. Post-grapple, the RAF jets underwent the Jaguar 96 program, bringing them up to the GR-1B standard. These aircraft were fitted with a new HUD, a hands-on throttle and stick or HOTAS controls, GPS, Marconi thermal imaging and laser designation targeting pod, and an upgraded low-level terrain contour matching navigation system, the same sort of setup used by the Tomahawk cruise missile. All this shiny new kit turned the Jag into a very effective precision strike platform. Soon after, the GR-1B was designated the GR-3. Then in 2000, the Jaguar 97 program, or GR-3A, brought in a glass cockpit, helmet-mounted sights, upgraded reconnaissance pods, and the slightly more powerful Adore Mark 106, replacing the troublesome 104 engines. These new ones produced 5,520 pounds of thrust dry and 8,400 pounds in reheat. These new units also had improved airflow to reduce engine fire risks. One of the most important chapters of the Jaguar story didn't come in combat at all, but in testing. RAF Jaguar X-Ray 765 was taken by the engineers at Wharton, who rebuilt it as a flying laboratory to trial the quadruplex digital fly-by-wire system, the first aircraft in the world to fly without a mechanical backup. When test pilot Chris Yeo lifted into the sky for the first time in October 1981, he was effectively flying the future. These computers didn't just pass along stick inputs, they corrected unwanted motions, kept the aircraft within safe limits, and even allowed it to fly in deliberately unstable configurations. The lessons learned here flowed directly into BAE's Agile Combat Aircraft program and ultimately into the Eurofighter Typhoon. At the same time, designers toyed with the idea of a Super Jaguar, with uprated engines, a new composite wing, more pylons, and a proper radar for air-to-air combat. It was thought that the Super Jaguar would have had the agility of a fighter with the hitting power of a strike aircraft. But like so many paper projects, it never went beyond the drawing board. Still, the research into composites and avionics would be found in the next generation of combat aircraft. But everything comes to an end, and the French finally bowed out first in 2005, their last squadrons trading the Jaguars for Rafales. In Britain, delays to the Eurofighter Typhoon kept the big cat in service longer than planned, with units consolidated at Coltishall. By 2004, the decision was final. The Jaguar would retire on the 30th of April 2007, closing nearly 4 decades of continuous frontline service. This was an aircraft born of political convenience and compromise, derided as underpowered and unsophisticated, but it defied the critics. Its legacy lies not in just its evolving technology, from unguided bombs to laser-guided precision, but in the air crews and ground crews who made it work. They called it the Big Cat and sometimes the Desert Cat. It could be awkward, frustrating, even dangerous. But when it mattered most, it never let them down. In the end, the Jaguar story is not about what it might have been, a trainer, a display aircraft, even a Red Arrow's mount, but what it became. A strike fighter that carried Britain and France through the twilight of the Cold War, fought across Africa, Asia, South America and the Middle East, and endured long enough to become a legend in India. Sometimes the aircraft that shouldn't have worked are the ones that do, and they keep on doing it far longer than anyone ever expected. There's a good cat. The Jaguar. I've got to say, this has been one real treat to dig into. A proper Cold War oddball that somehow ended up punching well above its weight. I mean, it's the aircraft everyone seems to underestimate, and the sort of aircraft that you walk past when you go and visit a museum. And yet, time and again, it proved its critics wrong. Now, full disclosure, I've been a bit under the weather while putting this together. So half of these notes were scribbled down between coughing fits and lots of cups of tea, but honestly kind of added to the fun. There's something about diving into the Jaguar story. Again, it's one of those aircraft where the deeper you go, the more you realise just how much it did and how much of an underdog it really was. And sharing that all with you makes all the hours of research and editing while coughing my lungs up worthwhile. So if you've enjoyed this journey through the life of the Big Cat and you want to see more Cold War jets, more forgotten workhorses, more underdogs, more development history that deserves a bit more of a spotlight, then please go ahead and give this video a like and maybe even hit the subscribe if you haven't already. It obviously helps a lot and it means I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Now, I need to go back to bed with my hot water bottle and a large flask of tea. See you in the next one.